So we've got one more sort of broad topic to cover this afternoon, and we'll hand it back to Rob and to Jim to talk to us about water accounting framework and groundwater banking. And I think we're going to have about 30 minutes worth of presentations or so, and again, opportunity for some questions and discussion. So,
Ted, did you have your hand up?
Bennett, I can't hear you. This is Ted.
Ted, you're not hearing me?
I can hear you. Why? Never mind.
I used my voice today that I know you can hear. So, all right, Jim, Rob, over to you guys.
Okay, thanks.
I guess to you, Rob, first.
Yep. So I've had a lot of questions in the past about what the SGA water accounting framework is, and in particular, I would say with reference to the water bank, what it is and what it is not. So I do want to give some history on it, and then move forward and talk more about the water bank, which is actually part of what we call our regional water reliability plan. So the water accounting framework, SGA formed in 1998, obviously a joint powers authority, with a mission to maintain the long-term sustainable yield of this North Area Basin, that part of Sacramento County. And in particular, we're supposed to facilitate implementation of an appropriate conjunctive use program by water purveyors. And if you remember some of my previous presentation, by the mid-1990s and moving into the early 2000s, we'd already stabilized water levels. Sacramento Suburban Water District at the time, Northridge Water District, committed to this conjunctive use program with Placer County Water Agency. Ultimately, when they merged with Arcade, brought in the city of Sacramento on the south side. So we already had a tremendous conjunctive use program in place. And this establishing a appropriate conjunctive use program, well, it was already there. And really what our dilemma was to figure out how to make it equitable, because Sac Suburban had already done so much, and we're trying to figure out how to keep that program going. So we talked a little bit about this as well. When we look at our basins, it's sort of a tale of three regions here. And again, our approach in dealing with the conjunctive use program was appropriate for the SGA area. When you look at the east and the west, these agencies have had historical access to surface water, and they're very flat. If anything, when it comes to conjunctive use, we want to start to see them using more groundwater. But in terms of dealing with that management in the central area where we did see the overdraft, and Sac Suburban was such a big part of helping in partnership with PCWA and the city of Sacramento, we wanted to try to figure out, so what should other agencies in that central part of the basin, what would be equitable? What would their contribution to conjunctive use be? And so again, the challenge was, the solution was already there. And we were just trying to come back and do sort of a post-mortem on how would we assign some responsibility to the agencies to do their equitable share. And so what we ended up doing was focusing in on that central area. And what we did was we found access to a series of monitoring wells around the entire central area that we had good historical records on, and we felt very comfortable with, and they were really distributed throughout that central area. And for this 11-year period from 95 through 2005, we averaged out the elevation change spring to spring in every one of those wells. And so for each of the 11 years, it's represented by a dot on this graph. And what this graph shows is the annual change in groundwater elevation on the left. So the red line says that there's no change in average groundwater elevation from those wells from one year to the next, from 95 to 96, from 96 to 97, etc. And on the bottom, we see that we have the amount of extraction that was occurring amongst those agencies that produce groundwater in the central area of SGA. And what we can see is that around 90,000 acre feet of extraction, water levels all happen plus or minus a foot. Nothing significant happening out there. And you have to remember this is average. So some wells are declining by 10 feet. Others are only going by maybe a foot, particularly near the rivers. When we get out to extracting 95,000 acre feet, we start to see these head differences, average changes of 2 to 3 feet on average. And again, we didn't want to see that. And finally, the only year that we had above 100,000 acre feet, we can see it's well in excess of 3 feet. So again, going back to the discussion about contamination and McClellan, we decided that regardless of what the sustainable yield was for the basin, that operating this particular part of the basin, it was a wise thing to do to hover around 90,000 acre feet of average annual extraction from those agencies using groundwater. So the next thing we did then was took a look at, well, how much were they pumping? And so what we did was we looked at the 5 years prior to the formation of SGA, and there are 8 agencies that extract groundwater. And what you're seeing on the left is basically the 5-year average. Those agencies were pumping almost 102,000 acre feet. So as part of this water accounting framework, we decided that everybody had an equal responsibility. So regardless of when you started extracting groundwater from the basin, we all shared equally in reducing that groundwater pumping to what we call the sustainability target of 90,000 acre feet. And so basically everybody agreed to take a haircut. It was pretty novel when you think about it. We did our own little adjudication on the basin. That was greatly aided by the fact that conservation efforts were starting to already pay off. We've talked about that, how water use in general has been going down. So even some of these agencies that simply rely on groundwater, don't have access to a drop of surface water, can reduce their demands, and that's been happening naturally through time. So the agencies agreed that they would have a new sustainability target. And SGA then set up a program of tracking their performance against that target. And we've been tracking that since 2012. And so for each agency, it's actually a cumulative balance. So when you outperform that sustainability target, you actually get credit in the system. So you have a positive basin sustainability balance. And again, we've talked about it a little bit before, but the average groundwater use in this area is about 65,000 acre feet these days. So every agency, with the exception of one, I won't pick on the county too much, but they're the only agency that has a negative balance. And part of that is they have these 2 very small service areas. One of them is very industrial, and there really aren't great opportunities for water efficiency there. The other one is a very small community area that they're in the process of putting meters on. So we anticipate that actually is going to change here in the next few years. But in general, the central part of the basin has benefited to the tune of over 200,000 acre feet since 2012 by being below these sustainability targets. And what we've used this accounting framework for is when agencies exceed these sustainability targets and they demonstrate that they brought in surface water to help do that, we consider that to be water that is exchangeable in a system. And what they've been doing with that is participating in these groundwater substitution transfers. So Sacramento Suburban Water District, for example, has participated in 4 since 2010. And we have agencies that have positive balances that are participating in 1 this year as well. And so that's given us that ability to account for, saying they've outperformed what their target was, and they've shown that they had demonstrated actions to bring in surface water, so we consider that to be stored water and available then for transfer. And so I think the important part about that is that it then becomes sort of a basis for how we might operate a water bank. We're going to have to account for agency taking action, putting water in storage before they can remove it. So the water accounting framework status is this. As we're developing groundwater sustainability plans, SGMA has sort of changed our world. As we're developing a water bank, that's going to be changing things as well. So there may be some modifications based on a broader analysis of what the basin needs for sustainability and how much credit we're able to give agencies for putting storage in action. But it really kind of serves as a beginning model. You set out with a target, you say, what are the needs of the basin? And when we can show that we've exceeded the needs of the basin, then we have opportunities for this water bank, storage and recovery actions. So now I want to shift gears a little bit, and again, now start talking more about the water bank, but you can't do that without talking about the Regional Water Reliability Plan. I always like to point out the irony here. When we talk about water reliability, today we talk about hydrology, but really the beginning idea for this water reliability plan came from the upper right here. It was the PG&E's Bear River Canal that serves Placer County Water Agency, actually washed out in April of 2011. It was a big landslide that took out the canal. So it was actually a beautiful day in April of a wet year. And that really became the beginning of our planning for reliability, because Placer County Water Agency came to us as we were developing our 2013 strategic plan and said, you know, it's great. We have all these senior water rights. Life's been good. We have our own reservoirs, but we lost service to a significant number of our customers out in the Western service area down in the basin. What can we do to make our systems more reliable? And really, I think the answer to that, and they knew it, is to really make them more interconnected with each other, create opportunities to share water across boundaries. But again, we had this mission now in 2013 to develop the plan, but no sooner did we adopt our strategic plan than we moved into the drought. So quite interestingly then, a lot of the focus of our plan then became around hydrology. So you can obviously see here 2015, we moved into these historic low storage levels in Folsom compared to their average, shown in the light blue in the background. So these are pretty scary times, but it was actually very helpful to have something like that, because in some cases we did some planning based on an assumption of losing access to Folsom Reservoir. I can tell you a decade ago, that was not a reasonable planning scenario that agencies would have been wanting to consider, but the drought really helped to drive that. So the approach for this water reliability plan is to really identify the vulnerabilities of the water supply of each agency. And in some cases, those are contractual or water rights issues. So again, for an example, Carmichael Water District received curtailments of a very senior water right twice in the drought. It was, I believe it's somewhere around a 1915, you know, very senior, but, you know, 2 years in a row, they received a curtailment. Another example would be groundwater contamination. So if you're an agency that's relying 100% on groundwater, and all of a sudden a standard changes for hexavalent chromium, now your system's not looking as reliable as it once was. So we really kind of looked at what each agency had in terms of its access to supply, what were the nature of its water rights and contracts, what was the nature of anything if they were near any kind of contamination, and issues like that for each agency. And then with those vulnerabilities in mind, began to look at mitigation measures. What are the kinds of things that we can do to reduce those? And the objective of the plan was to provide a basic level of service for each public water supplier under all conditions. And in many cases, what that translated to, can you all hear me? I hear a ticking noise. Okay, we're good. Okay, thank you. So basically that was self-identified by agencies, and in most cases it translated to indoor water service, right? So in an extreme event, you don't want to be cutting off indoor water service. You may want to allow for some keeping of plants alive. And again, 2015 was a very instructive year for that when we got the conservation requirements. You know, again, yet another vulnerability to our water supply. We considered current demands, and we also looked at, I'm calling them long-term, some of you might not call this long-term, but it was 20-year projections, and we relied on at the time, the 2015 Urban Water Management Plans for those demands. We completed the plan in 2019, and the plan included about a little over 100 mitigation actions. Some of those were structural, interties, pipeline segments, new wells. Others were institutional and contractual, partnerships with my local agency, mutual aid agreements, shoring up a contract, for example, Bureau of Reclamation contracts, which were recently extended for several agencies. Those were identified back at the time. But one of the chief recommendations was really for formation of a water bank. And during the course of developing the Regional Water Reliability Plan, we were able to take this really interesting look at the region's interconnected public water distribution systems. That was a mouthful. And what we wanted to do was ask two fundamental questions. First of all, what if we reoperated the system today that already exists? And we know we have agencies that have interties. And again, the example I love to give, I'm going to forget the date. I think it was back in 2012, 2013 or so. San Juan Water District was increasing its license for its permit for production at San Juan, Peterson Water Treatment Plant. And to do that, they had to test the system out at its max volume for about 3 days. And they needed that water to go somewhere. So they asked agencies to open up interties. And we were seeing the water that was being treated up here at San Juan near Folsom Lake. We were seeing responses down in the basin. Del Paso Manor Water District described seeing that increase of water flowing into a system. So we know that there's this degree of interconnection. So we wanted to say, what if we took advantage of this system that exists today? We also then asked agencies to sort of self-identify improvements that they were planning over the next 10 years. Again, new wells, increasing interties, both in size and or just new ones, maybe new pipeline segments to intertie with a neighbor, et cetera. So we took those self-identified systems and also conducted the same analysis. This was not distribution system modeling. It was taking a look at the capacities of the interties, the capacities of the various water treatment plants, et cetera, and trying to align those and say, what if in a wet year we tried to maximize the use of surface water, and in dry years we tried to maximize the use of groundwater? So the constraints we considered, first and foremost, was whether or not systems fluoridated, and that was one of kind of the first surprises that we encountered. About half the systems are fluoridated, half are not. And what we had to do to honor fluoridation practices was we split the region up into these 4 areas. And this represents non-fluoridated, fluoridated, non-fluoridated, and area 4 then is fluoridated. So we have these areas that we were operating and honoring and using the facilities that could move water around those various systems. We honored existing water rights and contracts. So City of Sacramento has a place of use. We did not assume it could go into an area outside of that place of use. If there were any constraints on the timing of when a water right could be used, we honored that. If you don't have a right to use it in January, we didn't assume that we could just take that water. We didn't make it up out of nowhere. We looked at surface water treatment plant capacity. So even in a wet year, what if in July that water treatment plant is already operating at its maximum to meet its customer and potentially any kind of retail wholesale agencies that it's also serving? That would be a constraint. We looked at intertie capacities. Again, those were a big one. On the dry year side, then we looked at groundwater production capacity. So, a lot of agencies, especially those that built historically on meeting 100% of their demand by groundwater, but are now, and we've seen overall demands go down, and they're also now practicing conjunctive use. Well, there's some excess groundwater production capacity sitting out there in the basin. We certainly want to maintain that for future reliability. But in dry years now, we can actually overpump those systems using that capacity, and they can share groundwater then with their neighbors. And finally, we identified operational issues. Some agencies that operate wells in particular, even if they could get surface water, they don't want to shut them down 100%. You might run into some operational maintenance issues, some minor water quality issues with bacteria and things like that. So we honored constraints that agencies told us that they would, even if you get it to me, I'd only reduce my, pumping by this amount. So that was the analysis that we went through, and it was really a spreadsheet exercise using an Excel tool. And the results were very interesting. And what they show us is there's a significant amount of opportunity in a wet year with the existing distribution system. In theory, we could use an extra 63,000 acre feet of surface water in the system. And that would thereby achieve primarily in lieu recharge, which is, again, what we've been talking about throughout the past years, is providing surface water to offset a groundwater demand. It also showed us with the existing system in dry years, we had enough groundwater production capacity, so those agencies that could meet their own service needs, but then could help out their neighbors, we could pump an additional 57,000 acre feet. So these are pretty substantial volumes. This is over the course of a year. So the average is somewhere around the 5,000 to 7,000 acre feet, depending on any given month. More capacity tends to be available in the winter months when you're not meeting your own customer demands. Then the second step was to take those new facilities, the new interties, pipeline segments, et cetera. And it said, if we constructed these facilities over the next 10 years, that we could basically add about 50% of the recharge potential in wet years. So we could be storing around 90,000 acre feet. And again, this is on the urban distribution systems and the interconnected ones, I would add. So for example, Rancho Murrieta is isolated. So they would not be a part of this program because there's no way that we can physically get them water. On a recovery side, constructing, again, more wells in particular, we could add more than 50% of that. So we could extract an additional 94,000 acre feet. So there's very positive results. Say there's a lot of opportunity to expand conjunctive use in any given year, but there are barriers. And the first one is there's very little driver today. We just got through the drought. and everybody did okay. Despite the barges out on Folsom Lake and the pumps, we'll ignore that part. But basically, we did get through the drought pretty well, and you saw the groundwater basin behave very well as well. So it's largely seen as very reliable. For the existing system, that cost difference. So if you're an agency that has groundwater and you're going to be purchasing surface water from an agency in a wholesale retail relationship, that difference is typically about $300 per acre foot more. So it's expensive to change to match up with that hydrology, to use more surface water in a wet year. And we've found that to be a disincentive over the last several years. And finally, those new facilities that we could construct, we estimate the cost to be around $288 million. And when we completed the study back in 2019, that's challenging enough. Look at today's economic conditions, and you can imagine that's even a larger barrier. So what do we do about overcoming some of these barriers? So the idea emerges to form this regional water bank as the incentive to overcome these barriers, so it can generate revenue needed to offset these expenses. We can do more conjunctive use. So we have opportunities to store water, both internally. We could also potentially work with external partners. We have this huge basin. It's stable. It has a cone of depression, so it has a lot of storage space in it. It's sort of, I have a reservoir and I'm not afraid to use it right underneath our feet. And there's tremendous opportunity there for storage and recovery of water. We can also continue to allow for these groundwater substitution transfers in this post-Sigma world, because there is a higher bar now associated with groundwater, surface water interaction, with groundwater dependent ecosystems. So it's really about storing water before you then go back and try to recover it. It can improve water reliability by expanding conjunctive use in the near term. What if we move back to an immediate drought? We already see we have facilities that can help us overcome that. In the long term, and I think the more important part is really, in my highly biased opinion as a groundwater specialist, the groundwater basin is our most significant opportunity to adapt to climate change. It's such an important reservoir when we consider the changes that are going to happen to our snowpack, the potential ineffectiveness of the surface water reservoirs to capture those types of events. Groundwater basin is our best hope. So the rules for a water bank are really already largely out there. These ideas have existed for decades. But more recently, the Bureau of Reclamation developed groundwater banking guidelines associated with the Central Valley Project Improvement Act, passed back in 1991 or 92. They allow for the development of these banks that says if you have a Bureau of Reclamation contract, you can, in a wet year when you have contract water that's in excess of your needs, you can store that in a groundwater basin, and you can store that for as long as you have a remaining contract. So if you have 20 years left, you could store that in the basin for up to 20 years. So that's a very significant benefit to local agencies that have bureau contracts. Might also be very significant benefit to potential partners. But you do have to store water before you can recover it. So it's not a loan program. There is a loss. So when the water moves, we know groundwater moves through time. And so this has to be technically determined through the modeling tools, again, the ones that we're developing. And of course, they require monitoring and mitigation plans. You have to demonstrate that you're not having third-party impacts, impacts to groundwater-dependent ecosystems, et cetera. And I'll explain that a little bit more. The second concept is these dry year transfer programs that have existed again for the last couple of decades that are hosted their annual transfers by Department of Water Resources and Bureau of Reclamation. They are simply single-year transfers, but they don't require that you stored water up front. So I think that that's one of the issues about existing groundwater substitution transfers. That's kind of inconsistent with Sigma, right? If you are simply taking groundwater and you didn't put it in there to begin with, you might be having impacts on the surface water groundwater interaction in particular. They do have a loss factor associated with those. It's called a stream depletion factor for assuming. So in the future, when you take this action to pump groundwater today, how much of that pulls from the surface water system? So again, a technically determined. And of course, these single year transfers also require a monitoring and mitigation program. So really, it's a sort of a hybrid concept of these annual transfers and these long-term banks that we're trying to develop for this region and honoring these types of issues that have to be addressed in these. So, Clyde, I'm going to start to try to answer your question. The issue about the precise operations that say when we can store, when we can recover, those will be determined through modeling and working with you. But here are the principles that we've laid out just sort of as an illustration. Again, this is sort of taking a 10-year hydrology. So let's say in year one, and again, this is an actual 10 years. I believe it was 2004 through 2013. It was an average year. So in the first year, we didn't do anything. We kind of just maintained the existing groundwater, surface water relationships that we have. But in the next year, it was wet. And what we did was we took a storage action and we recharged these volumes of water. You can see in the back what we have is a blue, light blue, that shows cumulative storage. But once you put the water in the system, some amount of it flows out and you lose control of that. And again, these are being determined by a model. So what you're doing is some portion of this recharged water is not available to take back out in the future. This is permanently committed to the basin. Second wet year, we have more storage, cumulative storage. We move into the fourth year now, it's dry, and we start to extract. And you see the gold line, that's committed. That's not, you can't mess with that. Your storage starts to reduce. You hit a second year and you recover, but you hit a third year now and you move to zero cumulative storage. And this is when you would cut off the operations for groundwater recovery. And this is common in established water banks in the San Joaquin Valley. There are already a dozen of them been established. And it's a rule like this, for example, that will ensure that you stay consistent with SGMA requirements in particular. And also local values, right? It's making sure that we have committed a portion of water that's been stored to the basin, but that we would not take that volume that we have on account and we would not go below zero. So again, just kind of continuing to move through the process. We see wet years and dry years as we wrap that up. So there are basically three modeling tools that we would be looking at using. And the first one is the Cassana model. And it does do integrated ground and surface water modeling. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't simulate operations. And so we have already been in communication with Department of Water Resources and Bureau of Reclamation. We have an upcoming project with them that's being funded by them. We applied for funding under a program that they have. And we're going to be using calcium 3, which is a hydrology model that simulates operations. So we'll be looking at operating within our basin to ensure that we're not having impacts on those systems when we're in particular taking storage actions. Another, and we have not really scoped this work out, I've had these discussions with Tom, but not in much depth, is a commitment to then, when we have the hydrology that's available from calcium 3, is to take a look at temperature impacts in particular and to mitigate any of those. So there will be a little bit of an iterative process in determining what these operations would look like, but those are sort of the three major modeling efforts that we would see that still need to be accomplished, and why we're still a couple of years away from having, you know, all of these technical issues dealt with.
Rob, just a quick time check. If you can wrap up in a little less than 5 minutes, that'd be great, just so we have a good 10 or 15 for questions.
Okay, I will quickly move through this one, but I do want to convince you that this isn't just theoretical. I do believe that by changing these operations, there are real benefits and you can see them in real time. So in 2018, we started our spring high elevations here at -27 feet, participated in a groundwater substitution transfer in 2018. We brought water levels down. In 2019, we had a pretty wet year, so we can see that spring elevations started off quite high, in fact, above where they were in 2018. So we'd already recovered from this action that we had taken. Now, the beauty was, as a result of doing the transfer in 2018, it generated a lot of revenue. In this case, the city of Sacramento returned water that was pumped by Sacramento Suburban Water District. They returned every drop of it back to Sac Suburban Water District. Sac Suburban used more surface water from the city of Sacramento than they've used in a decade because they overcame that disincentive, that cost barrier. And so what we see was summer drawdowns were very minimal. So the basin was saying, thank you very much by taking these actions. And despite, and again, the hydrology is over here, 2020 has been one of our drier years that we've experienced in well over a decade, with the exception, obviously, of the 13, 14, 15 droughts. But we can see here that we started spring of 2020 higher or equal to where we were in 2019. And I like to think that a lot of that was a result of the actions that were taken last summer to put that water back in the basin. And we can see, again, this is a Carmichael Water District, Winding Way, their neighboring district. We see the same effect. So these are real responses. We're starting off 2020 in a better position than we would have because of these dry conditions, but it was the actions that were taken last summer. Transfer guidelines require that wells their top perforated interval is at least 150 feet below ground surface. If they are not, you must demonstrate that they are pulling native groundwater through water chemistry analyses, for example. We have 68 wells participating in this year's transfer. We have 3 wells that have a perforated interval that is slightly below or slightly less than 150 feet. They're about 140 feet. We were able to demonstrate through water chemistry that they are pulling in native groundwater. The other thing we had to address in this year's transfer, and this is based on the new guidelines, is that each well near a groundwater dependent or a potentially groundwater dependent ecosystem. Trevor talked about the natural communities data set. We actually brought that into a GIS coverage here, used this half-mile buffer, and for each well that was participating in this had to go through a process of either demonstrating that groundwater levels were so deep that they were not potential groundwater dependent ecosystem. When we couldn't demonstrate that, then we actually had to take a detailed look. We have a spreadsheet of what the habitat actually is and see if there were limitations. So for example, if it was an oak tree, that's potentially something that could have a rooting depth up to 30 feet. And so we had to demonstrate that the wells at no time in the recent past have had an elevation that's been above that depth. So there are processes. Actually doing this year's transfer has actually been very instructive for the types of things that we know that we're going to have to address. And as we go forward and complete the model, now we're going to have a tool that's able to really analyze those things on a much bigger scale and provide results to the questions that we're talking about. So the vision for establishing this bank, I really am talking about this urban core, that program that I talked about for conjunctive use is where I'm trying to start this thing. But really a bank is I consider it sort of an institution. Banks are institutions that basically lays out the framework and lays out the rules, and it creates opportunities for others to participate in this program. And so I think through time, we can move beyond this urban core program that we're scoping out now and create a lot of opportunities with recycled water, with FloodMAR, Managed Aquifer Recharge. SAFECA has been involved in looking at opportunities for doing some of this recharge operations, in particular in the Cosumnes Basin. And finally, there's a lot of independent agriculture out there that in the future, if we could find funding through a program like this to offset that cost of surface water and provide that to them in wet years, a lot of storage opportunities that are existing in the future. But again, my focus today in the next couple of years is this urban core area. So we're still proposing to have all this work done in 2022. There's a lot of technical tools and analyses that we'll be going through. An environmental analysis, obviously, it'll be both state and federal, given that we want federal recognition from Bureau of Reclamation. A new accounting system. So this would replace effectively that water accounting framework that we currently have. Financial analysis, does it make sense for agencies to participate? Because it will be a voluntary program. Establishing governance and getting approvals from state and federal agencies. And then ultimately what we'd like to see is taking now that institutional framework and expanding it by constructing these new facilities and such that I've been describing to you through time. So hopefully we have time for questions.
Thanks, Rob, very much. Appreciate that. We've got about 15 minutes for questions or observations, comments that folks have. Rob, I know your hand was up. Bernice, your hand was up earlier. Did your question get answered, or do you still have a question?
Yeah, no, I'm good for now.
Okay, great. Betsy.
Yes, thank you, Bennett. Rob, what is a perforated interval?
So when you drill a well, you want, and then you put a casing in that well. And so you want water from a certain depth in the subsurface to fall into that well. And so a perforated interval is basically some casing that has holes in it that allows water from the aquifer to fall into the well.
Okay.
So it has to be basically what it says is that the top 150 feet of these wells has to be solid casing so that you're not pulling water from the shallow portions of the aquifer and from the rivers if you're near the river.
Oh, interesting. And then second question, so if you're with water banking, so you're drawing water out, you're putting water back in, you're drawing water out, so you're constantly challenging the levels that in the ground. When do you have to start factoring subsidence in? What's the measurement there?
Yeah, so subsidence, and I talked about that earlier this morning. Subsidence would not be a concern, and we're not even sure how big a concern it would be anyway. I talked about we saw 2.2 feet of subsidence over a 50-year period in the SGA area. There was no damage associated with that. There was nothing, that actually happened. It just, that was a change in the land surface elevation. So as long as you operate above those historic lows, you should not promote subsidence. So again, the proposal here is what I'm saying is that starting now, we've demonstrated we have stable water levels out in the basins, in particular the North and the South American subbasin. And what we're going to do is we're going to put water above those. So that becomes your bottom. And you will never go below that bottom in these operations. So it should not promote or cause subsidence to be a concern.
Oh, just one more clarifying question, then I'll quit. But you're talking about normal times. How are you factoring in prolonged drought? Then you might get into a problem with subsidence and things, right?
Well, again, really, when you look at it, that's why that storage, you can never drop below the cumulative storage. You would have to modify. You can't continue to take groundwater out at that point.
So you have to have contingency plans of some sort, like trucking
you would
water
have
in or something?
Right. You would have contingency plans. And again, I'd point out, really, when you look at our basins today compared to back in 1992 when we had our lows, in the case of the North Basin and in the case pretty much in the South Basin, we are over 20 feet above those historic lows already. So you're basically, you already have a built-in protective buffer there. To ensure that you don't get back to those historic lows.
Thanks. Let me let a couple of folks jump in here. I've got Clyde and then
Thank you.
Clyde. Thanks, Betsy. Clyde, you're up.
Yeah, let me kind of change your model a little bit just to make it simpler. It's kind of like you're kind of going to use the groundwater as a great big new water tank, and you're going to take water out of the river and put it in the tank, and then at various times you can take water out of the tank. And so the question I was really trying to get you to address was really, how do you determine when you can take the water out of the river and still protect the river?
So that's in working with you all. You are going to be able to tell us that after listening to Chris's presentation a couple weeks ago. Again, let me give you an idea of scale, though. Our operations, we're looking at these things could only operate maybe at about 10,000 acre feet a month or so. And so what we're talking about on a daily basis is somewhere in the 150 cubic feet a second. And today there's 4,000 cubic feet a second of water flowing down the American River. So the scale of our operations should never really overwhelm or change the conditions that exist in the river system in normal conditions. And so it's really back out on the envelopes when you have low flow. Yeah, you certainly wouldn't want to be trying to store water in those times. You'd want to be looking at maximum times. But again, we think that we can define the needs. So you asked in particular about times of spawning habitat, times of rearing habitat, things like that. Those could be predefined what those flows need to be. So that we can set out criteria for when we would be taking action. But in general, we're talking about wet years for taking water off the system. In the dry years, we're going to be using groundwater. That's going to leave more water in the system.
And again, Rob, where does that get codified? Where do those operating rules sort of get codified?
Well, I don't know where they get codified. We
Right.
obviously, as you know, part of establishing the water bank will be establishing a governance system and coming up with what we consider to be the operating principles.
Okay.
So there's a lot of technical work that has to get done. That's not something that happens in the next month.
Great. Rob Burness, back to you.
But Bennett, both you and Clyde are kind of getting at my question, which is within the framework of the conjunctive use planning that's going on and its possible extension via water banking. To what extent is it possible to account in such a way that you are setting aside water that could be utilized to supplement flows to maintain temperatures at critical periods during dry years for the fisheries? It seems like, and this is part of the accounting perhaps that Bennett is asking about, that the accounting could include a provision for having water set aside or groundwater pumping or some vehicle to put it into the river at critical periods when the fish need it.
Mm-hmm.
Rob, any thoughts there, or should I just?
I'm going to put that in the good comment period. In the comment category.
That's fine.
I can't answer, you know, I mean, again, it sounds reasonable, and it seems that we're developing the three tools, or using the three tools that would be necessary to take a look at that.
Great. Tom Goring.
Yeah, I'll just follow on Rob Burness's comment. I think, you know, the concept of abstaining from groundwater extraction to leave more water in the river when the river is at a more critical period. That is something that was part of a proposal that the region, mostly led by the region's water users, was proposed to the state as part of the voluntary agreement process that was being designed in 2018, 2019. But it was never intended to pump groundwater out of the ground and dump that in the river. The intent was to forego pumping and, in essence, let extra surface water back up into Folsom Reservoir that could be released into the river for a fishery benefit.
Yeah. That's the alternative, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks, Tom. We have a couple more minutes if folks have additional questions or observations. Ted, see your hand.
There we go. Yeah, just a couple of questions with regard to utilizing the bank to finance the improvement that you were talking about, Rob. One indication one can draw from the slide is that we might be looking at bringing financing from outside the region to help fund this, either through transfers or through direct investment. When we think about the use of this water to benefit other parts of the region, that's certainly an altruistic view, but are we also considering some sort of premium on those with respect to increasing the water supply in the basin beyond the basic formula you described earlier?
I think that we've had a concept that certainly if we work with an outside partner, they wouldn't get the friends and family rate that we would get for working with internal partners. Haven't resolved what that is, but yeah, that's certainly a concept. Yeah. In particular, for example, on something like a storage loss, it's common when you operate a water bank to have a more punitive loss, if you will, when you store water on somebody else's behalf in terms of what they can recover. So that's a common concept. And again, I think once we have the modeling tools in place and can start to analyze what some of the effects of running a program like this would be, we'll be in a better position to define some of those. But that's certainly a concept.
Thank you. And one additional question, tying in the climate change model we've talked about several times today. Once you apply that information to your modeling set of tools, it seems to me we might find that we need to actually create a larger buffer within the basin as groundwater conditions, surface water conditions, perhaps change to our detriment over time. So I'm assuming that we would want to be thinking along those lines in the creation of the framework, and obviously that might play into future revisions to the GSPs as well.
Yeah, it may also define that we need a more ambitious program.
Yeah.
You know, so even more storage. You know, and it will be interesting. You know, in particular, I think more of the long-term modeling is going to happen at the GSP level. So we're going to have an understanding, I think, of what sorts of issues that the subbasins might be expecting, and that may help inform some of the development of what attributes and what storage and recovery might exist in a particular subbasin. You know, I focused on the North and South American subbasin, but you know, certainly when we built the CASANA tool, and one of the big reasons that it was so important to do the whole model all at one time was because we do believe that, you know, there's an opportunity there to work with the Summit Basin and the stakeholders there, particularly with some of the more direct recharge opportunities like the flood capture and recovery. And we're already working with stakeholders down there on the Chumney-Hartnell, working with them on a project, just helped get funding to expand that project. And that's working in partnership with SAFECA as well. So there's already exciting things happen out there. And I think that those all create opportunities for you know, getting integrated into the water bank in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. We've got time for a couple more questions. Rob, I see your hand up. Before I go to you, I just want to see if there's anyone who hasn't had a chance to jump in yet who wants to quickly throw up a hand.
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Please, go ahead.
In flood hydrology, there's the concept of the probable maximum flood. Is there some corollary with droughts, a probable maximum drought, and can that be considered in your modeling?
That's a good question. I don't know, and but I will put that on the list of things to consider. I think in our case, when we look at our hydrology, we would be looking at things like, you know, the hydrologic sequences that will create. We would have the sort of 76, 77 conditions, 87, 92, most recent drought. You know, whether or not we can stack some of those together, for example, in hydrology. Maybe take the 13, 14, 15 sequence and create it 3 times, right? If we thought we could move into a decades-long drought, you could run an analysis like that to kind of see what those potential impacts would be. Good idea, thanks.
There's some paleo work that's been done with dendrochronology as well that you might want to look at. I'm not current on it, but Lisa Gromlich wrote something about 15 years ago. She discovered a medieval mega drought. So there's some empirical data for that as well.
Great. Thank you. Let's take one more question here. Rob, back to you.
Yeah, as a follow-up to Alan's question about essentially a mega drought, and given the fact that regional civilizations have collapsed over history because they have outgrown their ability to the water supply that's available to them. Is there any thought to taking a look at the total water demand associated with maximum build out among all of the general plans in the region, and what that demand might be, and how does it relate to the modeling that relates to future drought conditions and the ability to implement your water banking and other programs? Seems like the ultimate situation is an important boundary to keep in mind down the line rather than constantly just looking 20 years ahead.
Okay. I'll take that into consideration. And again, I think that the information coming out of the American River Basin study that projects out into 2070 or 2085 I think would be a good starting point for us to look at what we consider to be that maximal demand.
Great. All right, I don't think I see any other hands up at this point. So Rob, thank you very much.